Thank you. You know, it's a real super special pleasure to introduce Bruce McConnell. Bruce is the Senior Counselor for Cybersecurity in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In June of '09, he was appointed by Jeanette McConnell, the Secretary of Homeland Security, to serve as Senior Counselor for Cybersecurity in the National Protection and Program Directorate. Bruce serves as Senior Advisor on a host of strategic and policy matters related to security. In January 2010, he was tasked with leading the department's Cyber Plus strategy team. They're responsible for developing the overall cybersecurity strategy for DHS, aligned with the national strategy developed by the White House National Security Staff. Mr. McConnell received an MBA from the University of Washington and his BS from Stanford University. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Bruce McConnell. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much, Dan. It's really great to be here in Southern California. I didn't make it up to Stanford on this trip, but I did wear my Stanford tie, so that's about the best I could do this time. But I don't get out to California as much as I would like. The weather is perfect today. So I want to spend a few minutes in the spirit of the theme of this event, which is about collective action, which in some ways takes you back to the 60s, remember that? But collective action and the theory of the case here, which is a kind of capability, to secure the village. Because those themes really echo with the way we try to think about things at Homeland Security. Now everybody knows about Homeland Security. We have great brand recognition, but not necessarily great brand understanding. What do those people do at Homeland Security? You see us at the airports. You hopefully haven't had the experience of seeing us after a disaster when FEMA shows up. Maybe you've had interactions with the Coast Guard. We are a sprawling enterprise with a vast and diverse mission. And so a couple of years ago, the team got together and said, so can we focus this a little bit and try to get some coherence? And so we came up with a mission statement, which is that our goal is to help create a safe, secure, and resilient place where the American ways of life can thrive. And so how do we do that? How do we create collectively that safe, secure, and resilient place? Because it's not something that any one agency or any level of government or even government as a whole can do on their own. It takes a village. It takes all of us who would like to say that Homeland Security is a shared responsibility. So we identified 5 principal missions of the department: preventing terrorist attacks, enforcing our immigration laws, guarding the borders, safeguarding and securing cyberspace, and creating a resilience in the country to be able to respond to whatever happens. And to do that last thing, it requires empowered individuals, capable communities, and a responsive federal system. So those are the 5 mission areas, and you can imagine the different parts and pieces that work on those. Today, obviously, I'm going to focus on, as we call it, Mission 4, which is the safeguarding and securing cyberspace. And our particular focus is on securing the so-called .gov, which is all the federal agencies, not including the military agencies, and then also working to protect critical infrastructure, critical information infrastructure. So I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing that, where some of the gaps are in what we're doing, and some of the other issues around it. And I want to stop and leave plenty of time for questions. So that's my plan. So about 6 or 8 months ago, we issued a blueprint for a secure cyber future, which is a strategy for Homeland Security, but it's also a proposed strategy, if you will, for what we call the Homeland Security enterprise, which is everyone else who cares about Homeland Security. So that might be other of our brother and sister federal agencies, like the FBI or the Defense Department. It might be state and local government, and it might be all parts of companies and academia and everyone else who has to work together to secure cyberspace. And in that blueprint, we talk about actions that need to be taken in two areas: protecting critical information infrastructure today and building a healthy cyber ecosystem for tomorrow. We were talking just a few minutes ago about how it tends to be the activity of security professionals to protect tomorrow from yesterday. So the healthy cyber ecosystem part is to try to get ahead of that a little bit. So back to the critical information infrastructure. So this is what security professionals do all the time in cybersecurity, and so we do similar things that you'll all recognize. We have 4 basic activity areas in that realm: preventing attacks and incidents, responding to the ones we don't prevent, creating situational awareness so we can see what's going on in both cases, and then ensuring that we can respond and react and stay resilient and keep operating in the case of those attacks. So in the prevention area, some of the things we're emphasizing right now is continuous diagnostics, something that's called continuous monitoring. So this is looking at the systems inside the enterprise, inside the government agencies at this point, and saying, how's the patch level and all the other things that need to be maintained. I would just note that as security professionals often refer to this continuous diagnostic activity as continuous monitoring. But as we've rolled out a conversation in Washington, continuous monitoring sounds like we're listening in on your communications, which is not what's happening, as you know. So that's why we're trying to move the term a little bit to continuous diagnostics and mitigation to get away from the confusion about that term. Let you know what I'm talking about. We're focused, of course, on perimeter defense, and we're working now in a strategy which will basically work with commercial service providers, primarily ISPs to start with, to give them additional signatures and other indicators, some of them have been classified, that they can use to protect their customers who are .gov agencies from known threats, and also stop, so we can block emails that come in that are one of the main vectors, and then also stop and redirect beaconing that's coming out via this redirect. So we're going to be employing those 2 countermeasures, using the ISPs as the service providers, providing them with classified indicators. We're experimenting with doing that, something very similar to that, with some Defense Department contractors right now, large contractors. Turns out that's kind of a mixed bag for the biggest contractors. They have already got globally wired network. They're aware of what's going on in their network, so it's a 2-way information sharing. Not everything that we know is something they don't know, and vice versa. But I think as we expand the program now to more smaller companies, there will be some additional value added there, and I think it will also help develop a kind of service market for this service where ISPs can help protect their customers as a business offering. The third area in the prevent, of course, is law enforcement. We have the Secret Service in DHS, which investigates financial crimes and intellectual property theft, but we also work closely, of course, with the FBI to try to catch and prosecute cyber criminals. So those are some of the prevention pieces. Catching them as a deterrent, effect. We also respond, and so a variety of things there. The one thing I want to mention is the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, which is an overall plan that allows us, in cooperation with other federal agencies in the private sector, to manage the response and coordinate it in the face of a major attack. We operate under the National Cyber Incident Response Plan every day because there are incidents every day. It's not at a high level of activity it's not a crisis today, I don't think, but it's continuously operating, and to support that and to provide situational awareness in general, we have an operations center at the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center, which has on the watch floor a bunch of people from different federal agencies, representatives from state and local government, IT companies are there, communications companies, financial services sector has representatives on the floor. So we are trying to recognize that this is all players need to be present. Of course, that center is connected with the center at NSA and the FBI center as well. The blueprint on the critical information infrastructure, again, back to resilience. So how do we empower people and communities and firms and work together so we can get back up and operate under any circumstances. So that's, again, working on all the kinds of threats that many of you know about and that we face, that all enterprises face, and we face those in the government. And of course, with respect to critical infrastructure, there was a SCADA talk earlier today, the same kinds of problems, vulnerabilities, and major threats, possibly large consequences. So how do we get ahead of that? How do we get to a situation where we have something that's more defensible, where we're not always reacting? So that's what we're talking about when we say create a healthy cyber ecosystem. And we have 4 things in that area that we're proposing that we could all work on together. Educate, innovate, automate, and measure. So just briefly, educate ranges from trying to inform the public, the Stop, Think, Connect campaign, which asks young people to stop and think before they connect, to curriculum development work that we're doing in concert with the various universities. We were just talking about some of the programs that are going on down here in Southern California. On the innovate side, always looking for new ways to approach the problem and to jump ahead of the adversary. So our science and technology organization helps there. Obviously, the innovation has to come from academia and the private sector, not the government. And so we just established a point of presence in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley to try to improve the connectivity between DHS cyber and that particular location for innovation. On the automated side, we did issue a paper about a year and a half ago about the healthy cyber ecosystem that's focused on security automation and the need to stop trying to deal with these attacks that come in at machine speed by sending emails saying, check this out. We need to get the machines more involved in protecting themselves and us. And so in order to do that, you do have to be able to automate the indicators and countermeasures and be able to trade them in a way that is interoperable. So they can't just be a proprietary format, they need to be a standard format that everyone can exchange. And so automation, interoperability, and then the third piece, of course, is authentication, because I don't really want to be getting countermeasures from somebody who is spoofing me. So that piece is a longer piece of work. We're going to be putting out a request for information. That should move, and what the right roles and responsibilities are for that. And finally, number 4 under the future environment measure. So many of you have had the experience either as a security officer or as a buyer, as a CEO or operator of somebody who's trying to figure out how much money to spend on cybersecurity, or to make a pitch if you're trying to sell it. Okay, well, how much do I need to spend? Number 1. Number 2, what do I get for that dollar? Or should I spend it on training and personnel screening, or more technical tools, or forensics? What's the right way to spend it? And we, as a community and as a discipline, are still immature in that area and don't have the measures and metrics that we need to be able to sell our story well. And we also don't have the data and the standards there so that the insurance industry can develop in a positive way there. So that's another area of work. So a lot of activity. We're very busy, as all of you are. As a field, information security is turning up, making the turn around the hockey stick. So that's good news, but you have to put on your seatbelt for the ride. And so the question is that what we put out in the blueprint enough? Is that what needs to be done? And I think the answer. So there's only two kinds of organizations, right, in today's world of any importance anyway. Those who have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. So out here we're in the area of a place where intellectual property is key to the economy. We are in a universal city. And so we have a huge problem right now. American companies and companies throughout the world are losing a lot of intellectual property from very advanced actors and adversaries who are stealing that, although they don't have to use their most advanced techniques most of the time actually, because it's pretty easy to get in and get that stuff. And so we're interested in figuring out ways, and we need to find better ways of protecting that. And that requires significant kinds of activities and investments that we're not making now at this point. At the same time, there is the whole point of what goes up on the internet and how do you think about the kind of content that's up there, and differing views about that. And I'll come back to that at the end here when I talk a little bit about the international situation. So. One of the things that we're doing right now to try to up the game is we're working very closely with the Congress to try to get them to pass some cybersecurity legislation. So as you know, the Congress is not, as the President said at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, when a lot of members of Congress were present, he said, I really appreciate all the members of Congress coming this evening and taking time off from their busy schedule of not passing any laws. So we're continuing to work with them on this. The legislative window is short this year. So the proposals that we're supporting, the administration is supporting, and that we have bipartisan support, not enough yet, but we're building bipartisan support for in Congress, would do basically 5 things. It would clarify the role of government in this space, and in particular the role of DHS, and set some expectations for what we should be doing and what parts of it are more appropriate for the private sector to do, and guidelines around that. One of the things it would do is would enable us to create and issue baseline risk-based performance requirements for the most critical infrastructure. So, as you know, these firms in industries like electric power and healthcare and other places like that are not always even doing the basics for cybersecurity. So we need to raise the cost for the adversary and make it not just completely easy. So in this part of the law, we would be empowered to work with the private sector, with the regulated companies, and with the agencies who know about those different sectors that I mentioned, and come up with performance-based, outcome-based requirements. We're not talking about specifying technical controls. We're about saying, listen, you need to understand this is a risk, and you need to have a way of managing it so that you know you're going to be back up after an attack within whatever length of time makes sense for your business, because we all depend on these critical infrastructures as a nation, and we can't just let it lie. So, the third area that the legislation would clarify is the ability to share information both between companies and between companies and the government. There's some legal impediments, liability concerns, as well as antitrust concerns that have had the effect of slowing us down in sharing information. So when we get, or the FBI or NSA gets a call about an incident that has occurred in a major company, we come up and we say, can you give us the logs, please? And we'll do some forensics on them. And they say, let me check with my lawyer. And so then 2 or 3 days later, we have an agreement, we get the logs, because there's concerns about, if I give them to the government, am I now, all of a sudden, have I now conducted a wiretap, which would be felony, So those kinds of things would get clarified in the legislation that allows sharing of threat information, indicators, and countermeasures more readily. We would increase the penalties for cyber crimes. Some crimes committed through cyberspace, the penalties are less than they are if you commit them physically, so we want to get that squared away a little bit. And finally, to consolidate the data breach reporting, companies have to report when personally identifiable information is breached. There are 47 different laws in the states, so we want to have a single federal law that would subsume those and create a national standard for that. We will see how that goes. We may get some of it, we may get all of it. It remains to be seen. We have some time, but we hope we get somewhere there. I think it's really the basics, and in the category of is that enough? No, that is not enough either. So this is a Homeland Security issue. Homeland Security is part of national security. It's a unique part of it because it takes all of us to work on. It's a kind of a bottom-up thing in many ways, but at the same time, there are pieces to this problem not clear where the national boundaries are in cyberspace. And so we have a tradition here of not having the military operate inside the United States. It's a good tradition. We all support that. What inside the United States means in cyberspace is a little confusing, though. So we're working through that. We're closely with our friends at the Defense Department on that question, and with the White House. It's a continuing debate. It's a debate both inside the government and in Congress and in the public. But our proposition is that at the end of the day, the internet is civilian space. It's a marketplace, it's a schoolyard, it's a playground. It is not a place that we want to turn into a battlefield. And so whatever we do to protect it, let's do that in a way that maintains the kinds of things, freedom of expression, the ability to innovate, the ability to move freely in cyberspace that has made it such a powerful economic factor and a element that has created additional democracy and freedom throughout the world. It's a factor in making it happen. So that brings me to my last point, which is kind of the global piece of this. Just as the Department of Homeland Security can't do this by itself, just as none of you individually can, the United States can't do this either. It's a global problem, obviously, so I wanted to talk just briefly about how that's looking, at least from our viewpoint. And I'm focused on this right now because with our Deputy Secretary, we just had a series of conversations in capitals and in Washington in key European and Asian countries. So we talked in those conversations about all kinds of homeland security issues, talking about border control, counterterrorism, transportation security. Well, in every case, cybersecurity was on the agenda in a way, and front burner in a way that I haven't seen it even a year ago. So it's definitely getting our minds here in this space. So what we learned in brief in these conversations is that we share with many governments similar concerns and common challenges with our international partners. They're all trying to figure out how to organize their governments, who should be in charge of what parts and whatnot around cybersecurity. We've made quite a bit of progress here in the United States. We have the cybersecurity coordinator, Howard Schmidt, who's part of the national security staff. And I've talked to you a little bit about our partnerships with Bureau and NSA. And so it's still, on the inside of it, it's still kind of chaotic. But talking to our colleagues in other countries, it's like they have the same problem, and some of them are not as far along as resolving those issues as we are. So, what's the expression? Look tall, stand around for people. So, we are also trying to figure out how to work with the private sector, and they are. I mean, they obviously, European countries in particular, have very different relationships with the private sector than we do. Different public-private relationship, but we've been talking about our public-private partnerships and how those work, and there's quite a bit of interest in bringing some of those models in and trying to get the kind of dialogue and conversation going that can really help there, because they recognize that the private sector is the place where the innovation is happening. They, like us, are trying to thread the needle between privacy and security. So, in some context here, we just recently negotiated an agreement with the European Union on something called passenger name records, which means that travelers to the United States, the airlines have agreed to give DHS the reservation record, which is not just your name and what flight you're on, but how you bought it and pre-supplier status and whatnot. So the concerns of the Europeans was all around the privacy of that data. They have a different view of privacy than we do. Our goal in privacy is to keep the government from seeing our data. Their view is to give the individuals the ability to control their own data. So it's similar, but a kind of different perspective. So we worked out a lot of controls on the data so that it gets anonymized after 6 months and things like that to make them comfortable with that. And I think it was a good example of the balance between privacy and security, obviously not in cyber exactly, but also the ability and different perspectives that different countries have on this issue. We are working with them as well on cybercrime, and more countries are signing on to the Budapest Convention, which is a global cybercrime treaty. The Japanese and Brits have recently announced and made progress on this. The Indians are thinking about it and trying to get there, so that's good because it allows us to do extradition more quickly and exchange and work together on criminal matters. They realize the need for operational collaboration in cyberspace, and we're working directly with them, responding to cyber incidents and sharing threat indicators both on a bilateral and multilateral basis. And finally, they're working to understand how the global internet is to be governed. So this ranges on a whole set of issues, but we've been promoting what we call a multi-stakeholder approach, which means that it's not just a government-to-government matter of how the internet will be governed. It's got to be involved the private sector, academia, as well as government. And so that multi-stakeholder approach is starting to get some uptake in places where everybody realizes that we need creative and agile institutions to move out in this environment that is moving so fast. Well, I'm going to stop now and throw the floor open for any questions that you might have. I'm happy to talk about whatever is of interest today, and thanks very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Questions?
Here we go. So the question we had to sort of think here when we were talking about critical infrastructure, at what point in critical infrastructure protection, how do you create a enforceable rule or enforceable practices with penalties, right? So that you're not hurting either the taxpayer or the consumers of those utilities.
So how do we create enforceable standards for critical infrastructure operators in a way that's economically sound? Okay, so the way that I'll describe how the various proposals do it on the Hill, and you can make the judgment. I mean, there is a cost here. Somebody's going to make investments in cybersecurity, right? So somebody's going to pay for it. And so the question then becomes how do we get it? How do we make it enforceable, and what kind of incentives can we create to make it more interesting? So the basic approach here is to set these high-level standards, guidelines. Really, they're not even technical standards at all. Guidelines are requirements that are outcome-based, and then they would firms or operators of critical infrastructure would self-certify, or they would get a third-party certification. If they did that, that they were compliant, then they would receive some limited liability protection. So there's from events that occurred as a result of their cyber attack. So that's kind of an incentive. I guess not being sued is not really an incentive, but it's a little bit of an incentive. If the other piece is that at least some of the bills would allow us to fine people for not being compliant. We would not do inspections and stuff like that. We're not going to read all the plans, except on a case-by-case basis where we had reason to believe that there was a problem. So I think to the larger point of how do we make this cost-effective, because this does impose a cost on firms, which they will either presumably pass on to ratepayers in many cases or customers, because there's no appetite, in case you haven't noticed, in raising taxes. So how do we make that cost effective? I think one of the things that will help is that if it's done on a broad basis, that will help stimulate the market. There'll be more solutions available, costs will go down, we'll get some economies of scale. I think it will also, one of the things I didn't talk about very much, but it's a key part of this, is trying to do some things to get the insurance market moving. I know there was some discussion about that earlier this morning, but a couple of the impediments there have included the lack of agreed standards to underwrite against and the shortage of data, so it's hard to know what the risk profile looks like. So some of the reporting that would be required there would start to generate some of that data. So I think there's a number of different pieces to it, but I don't want to say that it's going to be free.
Okay, next question right here.
We do a lot of the command and control systems for Navy, nuclear subs, and other mission critical systems. One of the issues we run into is the government, and just in general, is that the approach, we take a proactive approach to cybersecurity. Most hackers end up violating holes in the software, and our simple concept is if you close them in advance, it makes it harder to break in. However, most of the contracts, RFPs, etc., all refer to manual testers and headcount and hiring 13,000 testers, with no room for software licenses to use any automated testing that's been around since the 80s to execute this stuff more efficiently. Since there doesn't seem to be an Office for Government Accountability on the DoD side, any suggestions on how they can turn this thinking around a little bit to actually use software to attack software instead of people?
That's a great point. I was, it's news to me, so no brilliant ideas right away. But there are some folks who are very interested in bringing more innovative approaches to this, whether they can influence actual contracts down at in the military department. It's another problem, but in the Office of Secretary of Defense, so I'd be happy to connect with some of those folks. I think it's a good idea.
You mentioned educational programs. What's the Department of Homeland Security doing in the way of working with community colleges and educational institutions to develop the next generation of cybersecurity people? And do some of your personnel require training where you send them out to work with educational institutions?
Yeah, so thanks for that. We have a program that we run in partnership with a National Security Agency called the Centers of Academic Excellence, and that's kind of the core base of our program, and that works with educational institutions of both the community college level and the four-year college level to do curriculum development and to promote research. And so there's a number of different pieces around that. I want to also say, though, that we are trying to do other things, innovative things, working with other people, including, for example, Sands Institute, on things to use things that, to use techniques like challenges and contests and whatnot to promote interest and awareness in cybersecurity, because our main focus continues to be with educational institutions and that training and trying to build that long pipeline and do the curriculum development. We also want to use some of these other things that appeal to the younger people and in terms of contests and challenges. So it's a lot of different pieces.
You mentioned legislation clarifying DHS's role. I was wondering if there is a place where I can look at the key provisions in order to start getting prepared for the implications on my business.
Absolutely. So it's the if you go to the Senate Committee on Homeland Security on Senate.gov, okay, and then there's the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, and look in there about cyber. You'll find the bills that the administration is supporting anyway. There's a bunch of different bills, but that'd be a start.
Bruce, I guess I get to get the last question in before thanking you. So, I'm a product of the Sputnik age, when America all of a sudden found itself behind the space age, the space race, and a lot of money and energy went into science, technology, mathematics, on the mathematics side of that, of course. I saw a statistic just the other day that like frightens me, that 4% of Americans, some number like that, in our colleges are studying science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The other 96 are studying not necessarily unimportant skills, but they're not the kind of skills that are going to get us to a cybersecurity solution. How do we as a nation, we the people, we got to do this. We got to figure out our way through this challenge that we're in. With DHS, Department of Education, how do we change the culture? How do we get a culture that is much more technical than it now seems to be, so that we get the kind of people like Alan talked about, the numbers are just staggering of how far behind we are in getting people trained to be able to do the kinds of security things that we need.
I guess a couple things. The White House does run a program called the STEM program, Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, Education, which is a broad activity with the Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, and technical schools throughout the country in various universities to promote this kind of cultural change and develop new teaching techniques and that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right, it is a cultural change, and you mentioned Sputnik, so that was a big event, right? All of a sudden, people responded to that event, and it may be that it takes something like that. We in the class of protecting tomorrow against from yesterday, I heard this just the other day that I think it was like 25 people were sickened by the anthrax attacks, and 6 were killed in anthrax attacks. And we spent over $50 billion as a nation protecting against that. So the response, we tend to respond to events that occur. So hopefully it doesn't take something like that.
Great, thank you. Thank you formally once again for
Okay, Sam.